Hello, so this is going to be part 3 and probably the final part to the revision to reading through the booklet on Wittgenstein's language games. And so I'm going to be doing languages public and Wittgenstein on religion, and I think that is all. Yeah, that's pretty much it. Oh, wait. And then there's something on the examined life, which I might also be doing. So yeah, I'm just going to read through it. We should not just concentrate on individual remarks, but consider the characteristics of the different ways in which we use language. In the language of physics, the language of poetry, the language of law, the language of love, and so on. By examining what happens in practice, we seek to find the actual content and logical structure of what is said, and so it is hoped, avoid misunderstanding it by imposing upon it inappropriate and independently determined rules of significant discourse. Okay, so I find that the narrative throughout this whole booklet is basically the idea that words don't have intrinsic meaning, and that the meaning changes based on the context that the word is used in. And perhaps the meaning only exists in the context of which a word is used in. When you take a word completely out of any context, which I don't even know is possible, but if you just have a word by itself, then it doesn't have a meaning. It requires context in order to be able to assign meaning to it. Okay. So we should not just concentrate on individual remarks, but consider the characteristics of different ways in which we use language. Individual remarks. Okay, so is an individual remark, is that like saying something out of context? I think that's like saying, taking a statement and just looking at it as a statement without any context applied to it. But consider the characteristics of the different ways in which we use language. Okay, yeah, so let's talk about the different contexts as well. And then it gives examples, so physics, poetry, law, love. And these are all the different ways in which we can use language. And by looking at the language used within each of these subjects, we first have to, I guess, have knowledge of the subject in order to be able to understand the language. I guess that's what it's saying. By examining what happens in practice, we seek to find the actual content and logical structure of what is said, and so it is hoped avoid misunderstanding. Okay, so yeah, you have to understand the practice of an activity before you can understand the language which is applied to that activity. I think that's what it's saying, and then that should enable us to not misunderstand what's going on. Okay, and yeah, because if we don't first understand the practice, then we don't understand the context of which the language is being used in, so then we apply inappropriate and independently determined rules of significant discourse to that particular form of language because we don't understand the game of which it's being played in. For example, if we don't understand poetry and we don't understand that poetry is typically metaphorical and not literal, then we may interpret it in the way that we would interpret something that we are familiar with, like law, for example, and we're obviously going to think that the poetry is stupid because we don't understand that the poetry is actually a form of art rather than being something that should be taken completely literally. So it does make sense that you should be familiar with the rules of which are applied to a specific language game before you actually try to interpret and find meaning to the words. That makes sense. Okay, we should instead follow the principle of don't ask for meaning, ask for use. And this is one of Wittgenstein's quotes that I remember, and I actually used it out of context once in a philosophy lesson because I thought it was a clever answer to not knowing the meaning of a word. My teacher asked us I can't remember exactly what the word was, but she was like, does anyone know what this means? And we were on the whiteboards, so we had to write down the answer, and I just wrote down that quote, and yeah, I made her laugh, but you know, it wasn't the answer she was looking for. Anyway, okay, so don't ask for meaning, ask for use. And again, that's basically saying that a word doesn't have intrinsic meaning, it only has meaning within the context that it is being used in. Okay, in other words, faced with a remark which puzzles us, we should attempt to discover what it expresses by considering the context in which the remark was made, the way in which it is connected with other remarks, the purpose for which it was made, the response which the person who made it is expecting to find in those who heard it, and the reasons which might be offered to justify making it, and so on. So I guess all of those are examples of context. They're all examples of the word being used in practice, and I guess they almost encompass the language that is being used. It's like all of these things aren't necessarily said. They're not written into the word, but they are there in the context. They're there in the experience. Like the purpose for which a statement was made. So I think that's important to the actual language itself. So you know how to respond, and you know. Well, I guess you've got some idea about what's going on in that communication. But none of these things are actually written into the word. They're all contingent on the context. Yeah. Wittgenstein realised that language is public. As he put it, there is no private language. We learn and check on language by our outer behaviour. Traditionally, the view was that the meaning of words lies in an inner thought or idea. Words then express this idea. Wittgenstein countered that we learn the meaning of words through their use in forms of life. Knowledge of meaning is revealed through behaviour. Even the criteria for what is reasonable depends on the individual's experience. Wittgenstein thought philosophy can only describe, not prescribe. Yeah, so that pretty much sums up what I've just been going through. There's no private language, so there's that means that there's no language which is but exists just to the individual, I guess. Language. So if language is dependent on the context that it's being used in for it to have meaning, then so why couldn't there be a private language? Would a private language be pointless because that private language would just be subject to the individual? Because as soon as you spoke your language with other people, it's then no longer a private language. So what's the point in having a language which is just known to yourself? Then I guess there is no private language, and okay, that does make sense. We learn and check on language by our outer behaviour. So we learn and check on language by our outer behaviour. So what does that mean? Does that mean that we act? Okay, I don't know. Traditionally, the view was that the meaning of words lies in an inner thought or idea. Okay. So I guess so Wittgenstein saying that we learn and check on language by our outer behaviour. So is this the way that we act in the world is reflective of the language that we use, or the language that we use is reflective of the behaviours that we enact? But prior to this, it was thought that the meanings of words lies in an inner thought or idea, whereas now the meaning of words is actually in a behaviour. Okay, I don't know. Words then express this idea. Wittgenstein countered that we learn the meaning of words through their use in forms of life. I still don't necessarily understand what he means by forms of life, because I've been meaning to watch a video on that. I was actually going to watch it yesterday, but I never got round to it. But I'm assuming forms of life is the different games that we play in life, or the almost like ways of life. So, you could be a teacher or a doctor, and these things all have different uses for language, and or different meanings for the words that they use. Knowledge of meaning is revealed through behaviour. Okay, even the criteria for what is reasonable depends on individual experience. Wittgenstein thought philosophy can only describe, not prescribe. So is this like the idea that philosophy is looks at what's going on in the world based on people's behaviour, and then it almost interprets that, whereas and its purpose shouldn't necessarily be to prescribe a specific set of rules that which people should abide by, which is sort of what the logical positivist did in terms of the verification principle, and that's why he's opposed to that. That sort of reminds me of a Karl Marx quote. Philosophers have only interpreted the world, but their aim is to change it. I don't know why it reminded me of that, but yeah. Wittgenstein on religion. Wittgenstein was not religious, although on forms he tended to put Roman Catholic. However, he claimed not to understand Roman Catholic dogma. What does it say? He thought that religion was too broad a word, so you can't find out what religion is. You can only look at how the word is used. It is the practice which is important. Okay, religion is too broad a word, so you can't find out what religion is. You can only look at how the word is used. Okay, so I think he says that religion is a broad word because there's so many different religions who play so many different language games. For example, Buddhists don't behave the same way as a Christian, yet they're both considered to be religions, and you can apply this to any religion. I think he described them as a family resemblance, because they've all got something in common in that they're all a religion. They've got certain aspects of that religion in common. So, but quite vague things which are in common. For example, that prayer, prayers are one of them. Scripture. I don't know, the idea of a god or a deity. That, like, most religions have certain things in common, but there's certain overlaps, but then there's a lot of distinctions as well between them, which really makes them separate from one another. So if you think of it as a family resemblance, you can say, well, you might have cousins, and they probably share your genetics. They probably share certain things in common with you, so that they are related to you, but they're not the same as you. So yeah. Wittgenstein suggests that religion has to do with living one's life by a picture, and one either does or does not have such a picture. How one gains, loses, or even changes a picture is left in mystery. This also means that we cannot evaluate faith by standards external to faith. Okay, so I can go back to the example about the science community criticising religion based on a scientific language game. 1 minute. Okay. Sorry, my sister was being noisy. What was I up to? Okay, so yeah, I was talking about an example of people treating a religious picture. Well, I'm gonna read through this again because I lost focus. Wittgenstein suggests that religion has to do with living one's life by a picture, and one either does or does not have such a picture. How one gains, loses, or even changes a picture is left in mystery. This also means that we cannot evaluate faith by standards external to faith. Okay, so we can't judge faith in the same way that we would judge science. Like today, people put a lot of emphasis on the fact that science is one of the highest truths, and then especially with the new atheist movement, they look at the religious scripture and they almost perceive it through a scientific eye, and it causes, well, it makes the religion seem like it's completely stupid, like it's trying to claim some sort of scientific truth, and even religious people fall prey to this as well. It's like they take religious scripture and they claim it to be scientifically true. And I think this is prevalent within the fundamentalists. Fucking noises annoy me. Especially in like religious fundamentalism, where they take the religious scriptures and they treat it as a scientific textbook almost, and I don't think it was meant to be interpreted that way. Yeah. Okay, Wittgenstein denied there was such a thing as a religious language game, although D.Z. Phillips, who developed Wittgenstein's ideas, thought there was. Phillips also pointed out that games are not strictly compartmentalized. There is traffic between games, so language games can interact and criticize one another. Okay, so Wittgenstein said there's no such thing as a religious language games, whatever that means, and I'm assuming it means something like, there's no distinct religious language game. I don't understand. So that separates. Is it perhaps because when you make the claim that there's a religious language game, that takes language into a context and almost pins it down? Like it said earlier in the booklet, it puts cramps on the words. If you associate language with a religious language game, then the word gets trapped in the bottle, and it's like you have to show the fly the way out of the bottle almost, or just not let the fly get trapped in the bottle in the first place. So, is that why he's saying that there's no such thing as a religious language game? I don't know. And anyway, D.Z. Phillips said there are religious language games, and language games can criticize other language games. Okay. There are religious language games, and language games can criticize other language games. So this is like saying that you don't necessarily have to learn the rules of one language game in order to be able to criticize it. So I guess D.Z. Phillips would be in favour of the fact that we can criticize religion from the perspective of a scientific language game. Yeah. Okay, there's a thing here on the examined life. So I'll probably just read this and then I'll finish it there. Okay. Wittgenstein sought to develop a language of symbolic logic. What can be said clearly. This was his goal. He wanted to arrive at an unambiguous language between people. In the Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, he argued that the world consists of simple or atomic facts, which are joined into complex facts. If a proposition did not reflect such facts, it was meaningless. He came to the conclusion that much of philosophy was meaningless. The last sentence of the Tractatus reads, "Whereof one cannot speak, thereof one must remain silent." Later Wittgenstein, we talk with many meanings which can't be defined unambiguously. He rejected the view that language only has meaning when it reflects fact. Meaning comes from very different ways we use words. There is no metaphysical structure, just human being enjoying in all sorts of activities. Words are learned as a part of a game and as parts of games and context. Words are used in all sorts of different forms of life. What matters is the role it plays in different activities. Within activities, between parent and child, words are learnt not as a word which applies to just an object, but as part of a game. Words have meaning depending on the role they play. Meaning depends on forms of life. Okay, so that's a distinction between early Wittgenstein and later Wittgenstein. So early Wittgenstein thought that whatever can be said clearly, so that he thought that language could be put into boxes, and he thought that we should restrict language almost, and that it is possible to be unambiguous when we're talking about things. But whereas, and here it says, the world consists of simple or atomic facts. So atomic facts are ultimate constituents of the world, and they're facts which can't be broken down, and they're not contingent on anything else for them to be true. But I don't think he ever actually says what these are. But basically, I guess you could say that it's atoms. But then, an atom is a material thing, so it's almost like it. He reduces the world down to a material substrate, and anything which exists outside of this material substrate is false or incorrect. Okay, so simple or atomic facts which are joined into complex facts. So complex facts is when you have atomic facts which form almost like a state of affairs. So you have multiple atomic facts all together, and these form a complex fact. I don't know how I'd give an example of an atomic fact, but I mean a complex fact. But I guess you could say that this room is a complex fact because it's made up of lots of different things, and I guess you could say it's something even more singular than that. Like this T-shirt, it's not just a T-shirt. It's made out of atoms, but it's made out of multiple different materials, and it's got colour in it as well. It's got dye. So, but if you were to extract out the atomic fact from this T-shirt, it would be just it would be the components which make it up, which are unable to be broken down any further because they're atoms. But yeah, I think that's what he meant by that anyway. Okay. Which are joined into complex facts. If a proposition did not reflect such facts, it was meaningless. So, if what we say doesn't align with or can't be tested to see whether it does align with the objects in the outside world, then it's meaningless. But obviously he changes his mind on this later on. He came to the conclusion that philosophy was meaningless, most of it, and the last sentence of the Tractatus, whereof one cannot speak, thereof one must remain silent. Okay, and then he says basically that language can't be defined unambiguously. So it's impossible to say something clearly because language, the meaning of words depends on the context. So obviously if you're looking at something from the perspective of a different language game, then there's going to be ambiguity there. You can't help but fall into misunderstanding or something like that. Because, well, early Wittgenstein thought that you could pin down language, but then later Wittgenstein said you can't pin down language and you shouldn't pin down language. So if you can't and shouldn't do that, then you can't eradicate unambiguity, and that's just part of language. He rejected the view that language only has meaning when it reflects facts. Okay, so this is like the idea that you can have meaningful language when it's being put into use in forms of life, which it says later on down here. So I guess that's a pragmatic use for language. If language has use or use in a particular form of life, then it has meaning. It doesn't necessarily matter whether it reflects the atomic or complex factor of the external world. It's just if it has meaning, or if it has use, then it has meaning. Words are learned as part of a game and as part of games and not context, and not just as parts as a means of defining singular objects. They're more like defining situations, and because situations are ambiguous and changing, then language is also ambiguous and changing because language reflects the external world. You never just come into contact with an atomic fact. You never just, well, unless you're a scientist, but of course, like on a daily basis, on a pragmatic level, you're never in contact with just atomic facts. You're in contact with complex facts, with all of these different things around us, and beyond those complex facts, there's also seems to be a whole world inside of our head, which is constituted of beliefs. So and that seems to shift our perspective on the facts that we're perceiving as well. So it's not just that there's facts in the outside world, but there's more to it than that. Okay, right, that's it, pretty much. Yeah, right. Thanks for watching.